The Week in Bible Prophecy, a Prophecy Watchers podcast.
Hi, I'm Gary Stearman of Prophecy Watchers, and it's my pleasure today to be talking with Russ Breault, who has produced a new film that, by the way, I just watched it, and it's worth watching. Unmasking Evolution is the title of it. And Russ, welcome to Prophecy Watchers, and it's good to talk to you again.
Well, thank you, Garrett. It's my pleasure to be here. I always enjoy chatting with you.
You know, this is a topic I can remember back in college, a lot of argumentation about evolution versus creation. And at that time, and I'm not going to tell anybody how old I am, but at that time, that was kind of a fresh argument. And I think most people believe the argument has gone away. That is to say, we've solved that problem. We don't need to talk about it anymore. But I think you would speak to the contrary.
Well, I think it's an argument that has never really gone away. It's just, if you go on to college campuses and you take any science-based college course, you're going to get bombarded with evolutionary theory. And I think you have had a general, over the course of the years, you've had more and more people kind of question it. At one point, evolution was locked and loaded. That was the way it was. And but I think fortunately with it and with advancements in modern genetics and information technology, I think a lot of people are not quite so sure anymore that evolution really is the answer. But my contention is that this is still taught on college campuses. And in pretty much every science course you take, whether it's geology or biology or astronomy, you're going to get bombarded with evolutionary theory.
Now, you talked about kind of the question being in two parts, creationism on one side, naturalism on the other. And so you have an argument there. And what's naturalism, as you would explain it?
Naturalism is essentially the materialist view, which is that either that God doesn't exist, or that even if he does, we cannot consider God when we're looking at the consideration of human origins. So in other words, everything must be examined from a naturalistic perspective, which is kind of a problem. That if God is in fact the creator, then probably there are things you're going to miss if you're only assuming that things came about naturally without any kind of divine intervention.
Well, as a Christian, and I'm holding up my old faithful King James Bible and looking at Genesis 1:1, where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," and that's pretty inclusive, the heaven and the earth. And then, of course, as we go on down through that chapter, we speak about the creation of humankind, the animals, the whole thing. And as Christians, and it's no problem for me as a Christian, I simply believe the Bible. However, that doesn't solve the problem for other people who would rather find an alternative to God.
Well, this is true. Evolution. Let's just put it this way. I think that there are essentially three religious questions. Number one, how did we get here? That's a question of origins. Number two, why are we here? Which is a question of purpose. And number three, where are we going? Which is a question of destiny.
Right.
And so you have to answer the first question first, which is, how did we get here? And are we just the result of several billion perfectly timed accidents of chance, or, as you just read, are we created in the image and likeness of God? And if so, then obviously we have a specific purpose. But if we're just here randomly, then we have no purpose other than just survival. and there would be no reason to believe that there's anything after this. So really, how you answer the first question, the question of origins, question of how do we get here, really does impact all the rest of those of how you're going to answer the rest of those questions.
Well, let's just for discussion's sake, let's just say the universe evolved and all the stars and planets came into being. And then there were chemical interactions on the surface of the planets, including Earth. And all those chemical reactions, after millions and millions of tries, resulted in a living cell. And that living cell became more and more complex over time. And then it finally became a dinosaur. And, believe it or not, and I know you believe it because you've studied it, that sounds possible, doesn't it? I mean,
No, not
it
at all.
okay, tell me why it's not possible.
Well, because you have to, 2 billion years ago, allegedly, in the primordial soup, it was just chemicals, and they've done the Miller-Urey experiment where they had lightning come in and it energized the waters, and presto, amino acids came into being, and it's but here's the thing, is that there's about 500 different amino acids that occur naturally in nature, but only 20 are used for life. And when in this whole scenario of life beginning in the primordial soup, you first have to have your exact 20 amino acids. They all have to be in place, and then they have to move on to form a protein. Now, a protein is a very complex molecule, and but here's the problem: is that a single cell is the in fact the simplest single celled organism that we can find is composed of no less than 396 specific proteins. And so, in other words, each protein forms a different function. And so all these have to come together before you even have a first cell. And so it is absolutely preposterous, because there's no reason for these proteins to form, to perform a function, unless they have a function to perform. And they have no function to perform unless they're already within a cell. And so the whole thing just breaks down. And so, of course, now they evolutionists have for years been trying to figure out how life came from non-life, and they've thrown in the towel on it. And now they just presume that it came in off of comets and meteorites, and so, which is it's just a convenient foil, because it says, "Oh, I get it. We can't figure out how it evolved here, so it must have evolved there."
So
And so,
if a comet or a meteorite hits the Earth, there's if there's an explosion, and the explosion churns things around and creates a complex, organic, molecule of some sort, and then another comet hits later on, and, there's even further complexity, and so they're arguing in favor of order and complexity out of accidental happenings. And I think that's a really good place to start the discussion.
well, yeah, because mutation and natural selection, which is the bedrock of Darwinism, all there's no indication that mutations are going to produce a gain of function within the organism. And so, the whole lunacy of the argument is that, as you're going from a single cell bacteria, evolving into a multi-celled organism now is able to replicate itself, and all of a sudden, so the first real organism outside of bacteria is considered to be the sponge. And so from the sponge came the fish, I mean, these are enormous differences. I mean, you go from a sponge to a fish, all of a sudden you have a a respiratory system, a digestive system, you have a skeletal system, a nervous system. None of these things exist within a sponge. And so, but this is what we have to believe if you're going to be an evolutionist. And it's and so, but we've almost, I would say, we've never observed a gain of function mutation. We talk about them. You heard gain of function a lot because of all the stuff going on with the Wuhan lab and COVID
Right.
19, and whether there was gain of function research. But all that is at the hands of man. We're talking about gain of function mutations that would occur naturally, all by themselves, and they don't happen. It's so in fact, we as human beings, we're composed of about 90,000 different proteins that make up our body, and so each protein performing a specific function. And it's in so but we've never observed the development of a new functional protein. So, I mean, that's a
Yeah.
that's a big deal, because, I mean, that is the basis of evolutionary theory, is that new functional proteins are developed. So that's how you get a reptile evolving into a mammal. All these different changes would occur. Yeah, we can't observe it.
So it's much, much easier in my mind to argue in favor of intelligent design rather than random mutation. To me, it just makes more sense that there was a designer, there is a designer, and the great intelligence that we see in our creation is self-explanatory. There's a God, and He made this. He made it very carefully, including, by the way, my ancestors, so that I came into existence not by evolution, but by creation. And it's really easy for me to believe that. However, and I'm really glad you've taken up this question, because there are people out there being brainwashed. There's propaganda, and you're standing up against that.
Every college student who takes a science class, even in Christian schools, are hearing evolutionary nonsense, and that just doesn't stand up to any kind of real scrutiny.
Yep. And you've taken us through many steps in your presentation that sort of make waste of the argument of non-intelligent design, our design by accident.
Well, here's a classic. This is, I have to read this to you. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins, who is the atheist biologist. And he's famous. He's written a lot of books. He speaks on college campuses, and he's still filling out auditoriums right now across the country. He says in his, I gotta put on my glasses. He says in his book called The Blind Watchmaker, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Oh, it wasn't actually done that way. It's just the appearance of design.
Ah.
So when you see a chair, and it's the whole notion of, you could say, well, it obviously is designed. It wouldn't exist unless it was the product of, that someone designed it, manufactured it, engineered it, developed it, and now we have a chair. But when we see a comparable structure in nature, we have to assume that it's only there randomly. We cannot assume any kind of design. And this is what kids are being taught, even at this very moment. And it's and it's amazing how people, there's an old saying. You've been in this preaching business for a while, and there's an old expression that says, that you don't have to check your brain at the door to be a Christian. Well, let me tell you, you do have to check your brain at the door to be an evolutionist. You really do. I mean, because when you look at the entire grand plan of evolution, from bacteria to a sponge to a fish to an amphibian to a reptile to a mammal, and from the mammal, all the different mammals that we see, and then ultimately to the primate and to man, we're looking at billions of missing links. They don't exist. And so, but I just wanted to narrow this focus down and have us look at one transition, because we always hear about the missing link between ape and man. We always hear about the missing link. There's not
Okay.
the missing link. There's
Sure.
billions.
Heard about that for years. And I've heard the other expression that goes along with that, the appearance of design. Evolutionists love to say, well, yeah, there is the appearance of design, but no, it's not design. It's a series of events that happened in nature. And they'll do anything to avoid talking about a God of creation.
So I wanted to narrow this. Now let's look at this transition from reptile to mammal.
Okay.
What has to happen? So, in other words, cold-blooded has to become warm-blooded. A complete change in the metabolism. Scales become fur. Egg laying has to become live-bearing. The egg nutrients now have to become mammary glands. A 3-chambered heart has to become a 4-chambered heart. A multiple bone jaw has to become a single bone jaw. All these are massive changes. And we're supposed to believe that these occurred by small, minute mutations over the course of millions of years. And why? Mammals exist simultaneously with reptiles right now, and it wasn't as if the reptiles had to become a mammal in order to survive. They both exist right now, and so the whole thing is absolutely ludicrous that these changes could have taken place by small, minute, mutations.
And of course, that's has become kind of a religion. The idea of mutation being random, and yet somehow some part of it becomes takes on the appearance of having been created. In other words, nature without God is simply capable of creation, and that you have to make that point. And I think in your presentation, you take it head on, and you have just touched on the idea of complexity. For one, what's another idea that goes against chance creation?
Well, again, I always like to say that everything living is exhibits complexity, order, and design, and so this complexity is real challenge, is because when Darwin wrote his book in 1859 on the origin of species, he thought that the cell was just a mass of protoplasm. He didn't. Now we know that a single cell within your body is astonishingly complex, with about 70 or so different functions happening simultaneously, and within that cell. And then if you eliminate one of those functions, the cell ceases to work or to perform. So in other words, what we find is that things, when you get down to that single cell level, they become irreducibly complex. So in other words, how did they come together, gradually over the course of millions of years, if they can't function at all, if you remove one of the components? The whole thing's absurd. And it's so the and so there is this concept of irreducible complexity, which is very true, because you think that when we look at ourselves, we are all everything about us, we have all these things, your respiratory system, your digestive system, your circulatory system, your skeletal system, your immune system. All they all exist in what's called systemic interdependence. Which one can we do without? None of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Because and then to think that we evolved gradually, I mean, because at some point you're not going to have all these things, But I don't, the whole thing just is just absurd, and it's. But I will say this, that one of the things that is challenging evolution among people, and why maybe it's less and less of a problem, um, is because with information technology, I mean, in 1953, when they discovered the double helix DNA molecule, they should have thrown in the towel on evolution then. Right then and there, they should have realized that there's no way that a molecule with that degree of complexity could ever arise from a random process. And, but they still hung on. They still hung on because, you see, evolution is the creation story of atheism. And so every religion has to have its creation story. And so they hang on to their creation story no matter what. And it's but I just when you look at because now we know that our DNA, you're packed in every single cell of your body, is your DNA is replicated, and it well, to give you by comparison, let me just mention this, that Microsoft Office uses about 50 million lines of computer code. Facebook uses about 75 million. Google uses about 2 billion. Your DNA is composed of 3.3 billion lines of genetic code. And so we learned this when we mapped the human genome, which was completed around the year 2000. And so now we know that we have this astonishing number of well, for instance, we have about 20,000 genes that are spread across our 23 base pairs of chromosomes, and they're making full use of this 3.3 billion lines of genetic code. But here's what we learn from information technology: is that these genes, our genes, are specified information. Each gene is like a packet of DNA that is the specific instructions for everything that's going on in your body, how to make the hemoglobin in your bloodstream. Everything is guided and determined by our genes. So in other words, it's specified.
I'll jump in right there. I think in your presentation, this particular point you're going to right now is very important, and it is the point of purpose. In other words, somebody says, well, the cell just eventually, through chance, manufactured itself. But it does leave out the question of how many cells had to evolve in a certain way in order to fulfill a purpose. And you go into that in your presentation about these cells are not just there for nothing. These cells have very, very complex purposes that were obviously there from the beginning.
The best example, you probably remember seeing this, I use the example of the pencil.
I was going to ask you about the pencil.
The pencil is just about one of the simplest things that you could use.
Yeah,
it's 5 basic ingredients, right? You have the rubber tip at the end, a metal band, a wooden shaft here with some paint, and a graphite core. You have 5 basic ingredients. Now, we would never assume that the pencil could evolve by itself, right?
Well, you just
So
were walking one day in the country and you looked down and there was a pencil on the ground.
right. And you and I would say, well, someone must have dropped a pencil.
But the evolutionist would say, no, that pencil created itself.
It came out of nothing. It's a miracle, evolutionary miracle. The analogy here is that what if you took all the raw materials, take the paint, the wood, the graphite core, the metal band, and the rubber at the end, put it all in a pile, and add 1,000,000 years. Is it possible for it to have to for a pencil to emerge from there? And the answer is no. But the question is, why is it no? Why is the answer no? Is because the raw materials cannot determine their own purpose. In other words, the pencil exists because man needed something to write with. So we invented it. We designed it, we engineered it, we manufactured it, and distributed it to be exactly what it is. But here is the punchline: is that neither can the individual proteins or amino acids or cells within your body, they can't determine their purpose either. And so in other words, who instructs these proteins that are coming together to become a heart cell or a liver cell or a kidney cell or a cell within your eye or anything? Who determined that? It is determined by the DNA. And the kicker here is that the DNA must exist first. It cannot be the result of evolution, because that's where all the instructions are. And so in this whole nonsense notion that life evolved from non-life, even with the development of the first cell, you still had to have DNA first, because that's where the instructions are.
Inscriptions, by the way, fit the idea of purpose very, very well. In other words, how are you going to do something is a very important part of creationism.
Absolutely. I mean, purpose is the key to everything. I
Yes.
mean, in my view, nothing exists without purpose. I invite your listening audience to just look around the room, the car, the office, the dorm room, wherever they happen to be. Look around at everything you see, everything. Your clothes, the carpet, the lights, the paint, everything in your world exists on purpose. Even a scrap of paper on the floor is not there accidentally. So nothing exists in our world randomly. It all exists on purpose to serve a purpose. And yet we're supposed to believe that comparable structures in nature are all just pure randomness and chance. We have to remember that the essence of evolution is that it is a process that by definition is unguided, undirected, with no plan and no purpose. And the logical mind, can't grasp that, and nor should they, because God gave us a sound mind with enough common sense, hopefully, to say, this doesn't pass the smell test. And purpose is the key to everything.
I'd like to ask you a question about time because in your presentation, you talk about the word instant. Was creation instant or did it take a long time? And so, how does time figure into this? Because evolutionists need lots of time.
Well, yeah. You see, I mean, there are many different ways to consider the age of the Earth. I mean, there's of course there's the what is it? I guess it's the radiometric of measurement of rocks, which says it's 4.5 billion years old, but that can vary depending on what part of the lava flow that you're measuring, and could vary by 1 billion years. But then also, there's other ways of determining the possible age of the Earth by the increasing salinity of the oceans, by the depletion of helium in the atmosphere, and so they all give different measurements. Now for me, I don't claim young Earth, old Earth. I don't care how old the earth is because I don't know. No one was there. Everyone has an opinion. And you know what they say about opinions. And so,
Yeah.
so my view is simply this. I really let me just say that in my experience as I have learned this subject and read lots of books on it, and it's I used to be a young earth guy. If you believe it, the earth is 10,000 years old and all that. But then I saw a debate. This must be at least 14, 15 years ago now, a debate with Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yeah.
And I expected for this to be a slam dunk. But, I came away from that debate and they both scored points. And I would have if I was scoring it like as if some kind of boxing match, I would have to say there was probably a draw. And I said I came away saying, well, you know what? If I'm feeling that, Bill Nye had points and Ken Ham had points, then why am I spending all my time trying to prove a young earth when really no one knows? Because there's just as many old earth creationists as there are young earth creationists. And so I don't want to waste all my time trying to defend something which we don't even know the answer to anyways. And so I'd much rather dismantle the lunatic suppositions of evolution and then let people make a decision on their own whether they want to be young earth, old earth. And my position is I don't care. And it's whether it's young or old. It's all I know is that complexity, order, and design did not come about through an unguided random process. That is preposterous.
You mentioned that word complexity again, and that touches on another subject, which is reproduction. Because reproduction, cellular reproduction, human animal reproduction, very complex and had to proceed from the beginning until now, had to proceed in a very special way in order to work at all. And the whole question of reproduction is rarely mentioned in this argument.
No, I mean reproduction is huge, especially because this whole principle of natural selection, which Darwin, that's like his religion. It's right in the title of his book. Is he on the origin of species by means of natural selection. So, but what we know now about natural selection is that it is not a creative force. It really just preserves the integrity of the organism so that it's able to root out harmful mutations. It doesn't have some innate knowledge to know that this mutation is going to be beneficial and this mutation is going to be bad. We'll keep the one that's good and we'll get rid of the one that's bad. Natural selection doesn't have that capability. And so when you get into this issue of reproduction, you know, by mutation, allegedly there's a mutation that creates something that is beneficial to the species. But here's the problem: is that you're going to have two organisms in the in the same location at the same time with the exact same mutation, and then they got to get romantic, and then at that point, then that mutation can be transferred to the next generation as a dominant trait. Now you could see that this could happen once in a while, but to suggest that this happens on a grand scale is just ridiculous. And so
Medically.
yeah, mathematically in fact, speaking of mathematics, by the way, the probability of a single complex protein evolving by a random process is 1 in 10 to the 164th power, which means it's never going to happen. And yet that's their religion. The religion of atheism is built on just smoke, mirrors.
So let's suppose that you're having a discussion with someone who is absolutely convinced that life evolved, and he's very content with this idea, and he says, "Don't bother me. I believe what I believe." Uh, what are you going to say at that point?
Well, it's interesting. I had a interesting interaction with a gentleman at the Philadelphia airport, and I was traveling through, had about an hour to kill, so I went into a bookstore, and they had a little rack of books there, choice books, and I've been another thing I've always been interested in is near death experiences. I think they're fascinating. And so I there was a book there on near death experiences, and there was this one guy in the whole. There was nobody in the shop, just the young man who was there, running it, and he
Right.
appeared to be of Middle Eastern origin, maybe in his late 20s, and so I figured I'd just have some fun, and I showed him the book, and I said, "What do you know about this?" And he looks at it and says, "I don't believe any of that. I'm an atheist." That's what I said. I put the book down. I walked over to him, and I said, "So you're an atheist?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "Man, that sucks for you." And it's he kind of startled him a little bit, and then I said to him, I said this. So you actually believe that all of life and all of its complexity and all of its variety came about through an unguided random process. No plan, no purpose, no guidance, no direction. You actually believe that. And he said, "Well, I just think religion is the cause of all of man's problems." So he immediately backed away from claiming to be an atheist, at least an evolutionary atheist, you know. So because once you challenge someone with, okay, now if you say you're an atheist, then this is what you have to believe. Because you have to answer the question of how did we get here? You know? And so but it's amazing how they will back away once you challenge them about what they truly actually believe, or at least are supposed to believe.
Well, they say, "I'll take my chances." All right, maybe you're
Well,
right.
as I said, that sucks for them.
It does, and yet I think we live in a world where that is one of the major systems of thought, and it's sort of like, "Don't bother me with this God stuff. That's too complicated for me, and I've got work to do." And you're just messing around with my life, and we're all going to go to the same place. And after a while, what you have is this homogenous society of atheists who want the best, and they're striving for the best for themselves. And what evolves out of that is the last 10,000 years of wars and rumors of wars and disasters of every sort because people uh, do what they want to do. And that, of course,
Yeah.
we, having read the Bible and having believed in a God of creation, suddenly realize, wow, there is a system that goes with God's creation, and that system promises us resolution and eternal happiness. Hey, why not accept that?
Well, when you compare the two origin statements, we have the one which you just read. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Um, but then the creation story of the evolutionist is, in the beginning, there was nothing, and nothing became everything all by itself. And so you have to say to yourself, which one is more intellectually satisfying? Because sometimes I call it the battle of the fairy tales. Okay, you say that I believe in a fairy tale. Okay, well, here's your fairy tale. And so it's like, to me, when everything speaks of design and intelligence, and that, in these complex arrangements, don't anytime you add a layer of complexity, you make any kind of random process that much more ridiculous. And all we're doing and through modern genetics and all of and modern medicine is that we're going deeper and deeper into our into ourselves, and we're finding how that we truly are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yeah, we are. And by the way, as we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, uh, I wanted just to go back to your production, Unmasking Evolution. You give what I think is a very concise presentation, and you lay out a groundwork of believability that's really, I think, worth watching. But as we're getting sort of toward the conclusion of our discussion, how would you describe your motive in unmasking evolution? How did you put this together, and what were your goals in doing that?
Basically, I hate being lied to. And we've been told we've learned for the past 10 years now, we learned all about fake news. Who knew there was fake science? And there's lots of fake science. And there was a meme running around on the internet that says 97% of scientists believe in whoever's funding them. Whoever they're getting their money from, they will support that premise. And it's a sad truth, but I just wanted to. I find so many kids, young people, walk away from their faith is because their underpinnings of faith have no foundation. And I was convinced that if I could just have 1 hour, let me have 1 hour with these kids, college students, high school students, and let them see the other side. Let's kind of expose the underbelly of evolution, not the picture perfect view that they're going to get in their textbook or that's painted for them by their professor. But what does the underbelly look like? And it exposes all of the fallacies that they want to hide. And it's so that's why it's called Unmasking Evolution. Here's a graphic for it. You can get this on YouTube. You can just search for Unmasking Evolution, search for my name or Shroud Encounter. It's on my Shroud Encounter channel. And I recommend people just it's an hour long, and I think it covers all the bases.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the news and all the news media that we all watch, and all the street marches, and the flags being set on fire, and the universities going south in a hurry, and we're seeing society degenerate, and we're looking now at a young group of street marchers out here, and you know very well what they believe about creation versus evolution. And so I would say that you have a real goal here in terms of what society needs to hear today.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I did it. I spent hundreds of hours, putting it together, and I think it's succinct, and it gets the message across. And it just makes people think. It's like a form of inoculation. Once you've been inoculated to something, when you're exposed to the real virus, you have the antibodies built up and you don't get sick. That's what I want. I want for this presentation to be like an inoculation for young people. Inoculate them to all of the BS that they're gonna get when they. And I'm convinced a lot of your college professors don't even believe this stuff either, but they have to teach it. Otherwise, they lose their tenure, they lose their chairs, they lose their funding. That movie that Ben Stein did years ago called No Intelligence Allowed. Nothing's changed. All that's the same right now, even though that movie was done probably 15, 20 years ago.
As I'm thinking here, it suddenly occurs to me that your presentation would be a great thing for parents to have, so that they could sit down with their kids and just watch it and then have a discussion. I think it'd be a terrific idea. And it wouldn't be over the heads, I think, of the average 10, 12, 13, 14-year-old kid.
Not at all.
And it's badly needed in our era. The respect for a creator God needs to be reintroduced into our society.
Well, wouldn't it be just like Satan to try to strip God of his glory as being the creator? And so that's the first thing he did, and yet I love Revelations 4 where it says, and in the the for it talks about the glory of God, and that he is worthy of all praise and all honor and all glory, because he is the creator of all things, and by his word and by his will they were created and have their being. So we have to return to our worship, to worship God number one as the creator of all things. We don't exist if it were not for God as the creator.
Well said. Russ Breault. The presentation is called Unmasking Evolution, and it's very, very much worth a watch just to refresh yourself on creationism at large. Russ, it's been great talking with you.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
Gary.
And we'll talk again soon.